My today's guest has contributed to some of the most iconic architectural and city development projects globally. He is the Arup Cities Leader for Southeast Asia, a TED speaker, and a fellow World City Summit Young Leader. But most crucially, he has been one of the persistently positive voices during COVID-19, a voice that has shaped and shifted the discussions about the future of cities post-COVID-19, especially in Asia. In order to build confidence for our cities to once again manage their challenges, cities need the flexibility to be fit for many futures, he insists. This flexibility, he adds, is needed to address the effects of current, upcoming, and potential disruptors, some of which can have extended impacts to urban landscapes, social constructs, and behaviors, such as COVID-19 and climate change. As one of the steps to achieve this step toward the future, he urges us to consider inclusion of nature in our cities. I am excited to share this interview with you. Hello and welcome to today's episode of Inclusive Urban Futures. I'm absolutely excited to speak with our today's guest. And I would just like you to tell us a little bit about yourself and present yourself and reveal to our listeners and viewers who you are.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks for inviting me for this. I'm looking forward to our conversation today. So, hi all, I'm Chintan Raveshia, and I lead the cities business for Arup in Southeast Asia. Arup's a multidisciplinary organization focused on the built environment. So that's me, and I get to do in this role really interesting work across Southeast Asian nations in different form, which I think we'll talk about as we go through the process. But yeah, it's quite a place to live. And I'm based in Singapore at this point in time in my life.
Right. And you have been also involved in some of the most iconic architectural achievements globally. So can you just give us a little bit of a taste of your work, of what projects that we know all you have actually contributed to come to fruition?
Yes. So I should add that by profession, I'm an architect and an urban designer. And most of my work, actually, what I do is very much at the city scale. So I think very early years of my life, I stopped doing architecture as such, but started focusing more on big urban scale projects, urban strategy projects. So I just came out of finishing planning the new capital city for Indonesia, which was quite a huge thing, because we started off the project thinking about that we're not just designing a new capital city for the third largest democratic country in the world, but also we were designing a new capital city in the climate emergency era, the first city to be designed in the climate emergency era. So does it have to look, feel, operate, behave differently than all the cities that we live in? So these are the kind of projects I get to really work on, beyond just aspects around strategies of how people live. We'll talk about that, of course, as we go through, but COVID has been really, really interesting to think about how we live, how our city centers are changing, how the youth is looking at our cities, how food has been thought about in a very different way in terms of infrastructure. How does that change the way we look at cities? So I think that's me. And I was in the UK. I moved to Singapore 7 years back. So before that, I was based in the London office in the UK, and there I worked on the corridor planning for the new high-speed rail that is coming through in the UK as we speak. So thinking about where the station should be, where people should live, and how it could change, how it could catalyze change across the north of the country from London. And it's absolutely brilliant how you start thinking about 30 years hence, how that's going to change people's lives as we go through.
You mentioned very, very quickly that COVID has changed the way we live, the way we work. And I think there are many commentators that are kind of speculated that there will be some new trends going on. From your perspective, what is it the change that you see? What is the key impact COVID-19 from your perspective? I guess from Southeast Asia brought to the forefront. What are some trends that you see?
It is. I mean, some of the trends that we all are absolutely conscious of. The fact that we realize that most of us can actually work from all kinds of places. That simple fact has made all of us cities experts, cities planners, to rethink how the future of our city is going to be. Because and we are right now talking to various governments across Southeast Asia for exactly that point. Most governments are worried about the fact that, including my organization, so Arup is going to be a hybrid for the rest of its life, which means we're going to be working 2 or 3 days a week from office and 2 days or whatever from home, which basically means that every office starts thinking like that. We have 20% of office space in the city center suddenly empty.
Exactly.
What does that mean for the city? What does that mean for the government? What does that mean for people living around it or living based on that? Sadly, every other week that I've gone back to the office, I've seen one cafe shutting down. But every other week that I'm around my house, there's a new cafe opening up.
Exactly,
so
right.
the dynamics are changing within the city, and that is absolutely interesting, of how every mechanism around, including waste collection, water movement, all of that has to be thought about completely differently now for the future to come. So that's been absolutely exciting. But also, what does that mean in terms of experiencing the one city we are working with right now is thinking about tourism. What is tourism, or people experiencing another city or another part of the country in the age of COVID or post-COVID? So interesting strategies.
And how do you feel about it? I mean, you said, okay, we are not going to be coming to the office anymore. From your personal perspective, how do you feel about that? I mean, is that a good thing, a bad thing? How do we manage international projects in this way when people are not coming to the office, or maybe they didn't have to come anyway?
I would not take away the importance of people working together in person. I'm currently, thanks to Singapore, the way it is, I do go back and forth. So I literally work 2 days from the office and 3 days from home. And in those 2 days, I end up meeting my colleagues who I work with. City projects are by default complex. I would have a transport person, an energy person, a solar energy expert, and also a waste management expert. Everyone sitting around us, a social scientist sitting along with us, thinking about how do you work with the cities. And there's only so much you can do this way on the screen. So I don't think that will go away ever, and I don't think you should ever do that. I think there is so much in there for all of us working together. But at the same time, I can't imagine how it was. Why did I go to office 5 days a week before? I'm so happy to not do that anymore. So
that's correct. I was always saying, that I think that the first time we met in Singapore, I was saying at that time, I think it was 2013 or something like that for some reason, we still live at the time, as if we were in the times of Industrial Revolution, as if I have to come to the factory to turn my screw so that you can have the opportunity to turn your screw, because if my screw is not turned, your screw cannot be turned. And I said, well, knowledge economy doesn't really work like that, does it? Right? And for us who have been working all around the world, I mean, there were so many times that we were just not in the office because we had to be somewhere else, and we had to deal with it, and we could deal with it. Right. I just remember reading, about the development of Marina Sands Bay that your company helped to build, and how teams from 4 continents were actually synchronizing for 24 hours around the clock to be able to deliver it. And not everybody was in the same office at that time, so that it can be done, right? And I think that there's lots to learn from these, practices that we didn't realize we did out of the office, right? I wanted to ask you about another thing. There are many people who are talking about, at least on this side of the oceans or continents, this side of the globe, right? Where it's morning while you have the afternoon, about the death of the central business district. What is your take on that? Is this where we're going, or is this a little bit too extreme?
It's interesting because I that was the title of one of my presentations in 2018, and this was pre-pandemic, of course. And that time I was talking about the death of the CBD, purely from the point of view of that CBDs can no longer just be glass office towers. They need to become a piece of a city, a piece of the city, which has a heart, has a community within it. And here we are. This is exactly what Singapore government is trying to do right now. Of that 20% stack, which is going to be lying empty now, that the only way the governments can think about creating resilience within the city centers is to make them mixed use, which means that, you know, a cafe out there is not just dependent on knowledge economy workers like us going to work, but also is there for an uncle and an auntie who are living around the corner, and a child who's passing by and going to the school in that same neighborhood. Because as soon as you have a mixed use CBD, you're then talking about community facilities and all of that. So more and more so, it's becoming a reality, and this COVID has just pushed that. Let's call it. It's exponentially pushed that idea of creating a very different kind of central business districts of the future.
Right.
So that way, I would say the death of the 20th century CBD and the birth of a very, very new 21st century CBD.
Yeah. And how about there are, again, commentators that are saying, well, now this 20% that is kind of abandoned by the offices, that's going to be affordable housing. I would like to run that by you.
It's a very difficult question. It is indeed a very difficult question. Coincidentally, we're actually working with our in-house economists on this very thing. It's because the economists of the world measure CBDs in the form of the GDP value of the country, like how much the city center capital cities have a GDP, and the huge part of that is real estate. And if we change that idea of the real estate in a very different way of looking at it from the affordable housing point of view, another thing, what does that mean for the future economic mechanism of a CBD? But to be honest, that'll have to change. The worst thing that we can do is that we have CBDs with only private shiny glass houses next to private shiny office buildings. And there again, it's not a piece of a city anymore. So if we do it, it has to be inclusive.
That's correct. And maybe change economic theory from the macroeconomic theory to maybe, you know, looking at the fragmentation of the real estate markets. And maybe if we are thinking about the idea of fragmented real estate or housing markets, then we can mix the different tenures and different uses and different, you know, kind of price tagged urban functions together, right? Because
absolutely,
that just comes to mind after what you were saying about the way things are done now.
Yeah, and we can't afford to make mistakes that we did in the 20th century. Paris went through that same problem, right? The fact that there only certain kind of class could live in the cities, and then the certain different kind of class had to be outside the city, and that created a problem. And in 21st century, we've got to be way more.
You mean which period exactly? I don't think that everybody would know the history of urbanization. So can you put a date on it?
Oh no, I'm just talking about. Sorry, I may not have the best answer in terms of Paris, but the whole idea of I mean, from what I had read about the Paris riots in the recent past has been around the fact that there are only there's a certain class of people who end up living in the city centers, which is a very different economic strata as against people away from the city who had a much more lower economic strata. And so that differentiator of rich in the city and non-rich outside the city center.
You mean the recent riots, like in the couple of years ago?
That's right. Would that be the right deduction?
A part of it. That
Okay.
makes me
So
think of
then maybe
how reporting works.
yeah. The reporting work very differently in this part of the world on that
Yeah,
one.
how reporting works. I mean, no, actually, yeah, there is a part of it. There's certainly I mean, you know, when you're living in a specific context, when you have like layers and layers and layers of complexity, you know, that you are kind of surrounded with, and then it's always interesting to when you have like one angle being, you know, kind of emphasized. There is certainly a bit to it, I think, and I think that this is an interesting point to discuss in terms of housing affordability in Paris or in London or in New York or in Moscow, right? I mean, is that really, if we can allow housing prices to go up as fast as we allow them to do now, we will in fact have maybe a fast conclusion of that piece, right? But this is where the things are heading. So we must be thinking about, do we really need 120% increase of housing prices in 10 years? Is that really what is necessary, right? I would not really say that this is a healthy, you know, increase of, you know, value of any product, right? It is a perceived value of a product that, you know, we have because of a specific construct from the 20th century that maybe you said we are still living now, and we might ask ourselves, are our salaries increasing 120%, you know, in 10 years? You know, did we, you know, kind of maybe from junior position to the kind of mid-management senior position, maybe, but then after that, it doesn't go exponentially so high for everyone, at least, right? Mainly people. So I think that there is definitely a point to that. I was following you last year, you know, all the speeches that you have given, including TED, including World City Summit. And what I liked really about your speech in World City Summit is that, I mean, actually the title, the idea, a design of a city that is ready for many futures. Am I paraphrasing your title correctly?
Fit for many futures. That's right.
Fit for many futures. So can you tell me a little bit about that? I would really like to kind of delve into that. I thought that your conceptualization was incredible and kind of reflecting your own personality, and I believe, and the fact that, you know, you worked in so many places, that your career is amazing, and that requires an incredible amount of work and you know, understanding that you're gonna be trying yourself many different futures. So could you tell us a little bit about that? I'm totally excited about this bit.
I probably would start a bit of the personal story because that's get attached. So I was born in India and this is prior to in the city Mumbai, and this is prior to any kind of opening up of the economy of the country. So for my first 17, 18 years, I hadn't even seen a Coca-Cola or for that matter, known anything about a Western television or a channel. I had 2 state television channels. And
I was in Yugoslavia, we had the same.
Yeah, right, there you go. Exactly. So yeah, exactly. So we've seen that opening up of in the 90s, where where it became a very unipolar world, and then things opened up, and we had all the opportunities that came in after that. At some point, I had the opportunity to move to Holland, and then Holland to the UK, and in between, I have lived a bit in Australia and Toronto to eventually get here. During those times, the cities that I have lived in have changed remarkably. So Mumbai of the 90s, and to see it now is very, 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 very different. was any of this planned? And mainly so in developing countries, where most of the places where things are not planned, they just happen, and then planning happens after that to make it to adjust to that. So that is a very interesting point in time. So when I was trying to talk about fit for many futures, is that we are where we are right now because there's a linear line that came through. There's certain decisions that were made that lead us to this one point. But here onwards, there are multiple decisions that could be made that could basically take us to anywhere possibly. And in those cases, cities, because they're much more physical in nature in terms of certain physicalities within cities, they need to be flexible enough, that net has to be flexible enough to allow for these futures to happen without collapsing. And because quite a lot of cities are not designed like that, they collapse. And then you see issues. So for example, in Mumbai, the amount of informality that happened in terms of housing is exponential since the middle of 90s when the economy opened to now. And literally there are no policies to resolve that problem. So you just keep getting it worse and worse. And similarly in every other city in the world, we've seen that. Singapore is of course a developed nation, but the changes that's seen from 90s to now are decisions that they made 30 years back to allow for something to happen to where we are right now, where it is really at the top of the charts for everything almost. So that's what I meant by there's certain fixes that you create in your resolve to allow for the flexes to happen for that fit for many futures.
And how, I mean, for an average, city planner, architect, or, like those one, I mean, or, kind of people coming just into this profession that is quite broad. I mean, if you're thinking of planning and, master plans and all that, how do you actually allow flexibility in that? Like if you're making a master plan, your fixation is that this is something that has to be, delivered old style, right? So how do you achieve this flexibility? Where does it come in?
I can give an example for the Indonesia capital city, which is, of course, we just finished the plan for it. And by the way, that entire second phase of the project was all done online. So literally, we had the social scientists sitting in Indonesia being on site whilst we were sitting in Singapore, and other colleagues in Indonesia all working without being on site. That was very painful, but we managed it. So we were clear that if that city had to be designed, the first capital city to be designed in climate emergency era, it had to, as I said, breathe, function, operate differently. And it had to be very clear that it had to be a city truly for all. And by all, I meant nature, animals, flora, fauna, everything that is there currently on site, but also what could happen in the future. So we had clear fixes that we decided with. The fixes were wherever there is nature, there is water, etc., that's going to be retained, and not just retained, it's going to be regenerated. We'll flourish it. So this is a clear fix. No one in the next 50 years because the aspect of designing a city is that you can only do so much. 50 years hence, someone may do something else with it. I'll never be able to see what the city is truly going to look like 100 years from now. But we could actually plan for certain fixes that everyone is equally important, and not just human beings, but everyone on site. So that plan was very clear when we planned that out. But in allowing within that, the whole structure of that plan, were a lot of these flexes where we said, okay, the most important thing is equity. And that is, by the way, a biggest issue right now in Southeast Asia post-COVID, the equal access to just basic necessities, to opportunities, etc. So if that was the case, and we are designing cities from scratch, we could then think about giving equal access to anyone, anywhere in the city to basic amenities such as a school or a doctor's clinic or supermarket, shopping mall, etc. That should be able to be accessed by just walking, for example. So that was another fix. But after that, then everything that the form revolved around those fixes were completely a flex, which would change in the future, whoever comes and does something else in 20 years time, etc. But basic tenets of equity, about respecting nature, and all of those were fixes and non-challengeable. That's exactly what we're going to do. So I'm trying to keep it as layman terms as possible, but this is exactly how we started off with doing that city.
Now, You spoke about living in many different places and working with little different places that function differently. I mean, to what extent that experience actually helped you formulate this concept of a urbanism that might be ready for many different outcomes or futures?
I think it's the experience of living in cities which have not been able to do that, which makes you realize that there have been the planners of the 20th century were so fixated by the fact that they thought that this was the right move, that currently we are facing this big issue of decarbonization. We are currently facing this issue of getting cars out of the streets and people walking in a very different way or living in a different way, because they were so rigid in the 20th century that those changes are becoming so difficult to manage. So in fact, what has not happened in the past makes you think about how flexible the systems need to be in the future.
Because when you mentioned Mumbai and it was not planned, it happened, and then the planning happened after that. I mean, I've seen that in the Middle East, specifically with Bedouin villages. And I thought that there was a tremendous value in able to deconstruct that traditional rigidity by actually working in environments that have the logic of their own, that is not coded in architecture as the right thing. So I thought that was quite good, because I thought that my primary learning in very early in my career came when I had to design an urban plan for a Bedouin village, and I had to I better throw out everything I knew through the window, because their conceptualization of space was just not continental European. It just wasn't, and they were refusing to accept the master plan for 7 years. I mean, they had a very good friend, Jesus, because it was the Mount Tabor, the place of transfiguration. So they had a big say. They said that we don't have naft, we don't have oil, but we have Jesus, right? And so when they said no, to the master plan, they had a backing, there, to actually say no. So I thought that when you were talking about Mumbai, and the way that you see the city developing before the intervention and after intervention, right? That is a very, very useful learning tool, because one understands that it is okay, and it opens up different possibilities. I mean, sometimes it's just too much, right? It's 3,000 people and 12 million. It's not the same to manage, but I was just thinking that kind of thing is really, really valuable as well. And I think that sometimes we discard that kind of learning, that happens in reality, in a traditional thinking.
And I think these are what I call, flexes, because in fact, one of the most important learnings that I've had moving from different countries or cities is the aspect of identity and culture. And we all think that culture is what it is. That's a culture of that country. But the culture changes. It changes with the way we change in life, the acceptance of things, and how we change. As I said earlier, 1990s culture of Mumbai was very different than the culture what is now. And if it is different, then how can we live the same as what it was? How do we allow for that to dynamically change as well? Yeah, so that's been super interesting.
You're absolutely right, because I mean, all these places where you have lived have had life after you left. You mentioned a couple of times equity right now, and that is a very important point that you're working on now in Southeast Asia. And I thought that the concept of inclusion that is kind of very much used right now here, and in many businesses and international organizations. So I thought to kind of talk about a little bit about that, of like, if you're thinking about the concept of inclusion, what does that mean to you? I mean, how do you interpret it? What does that mean to you personally?
Okay, let me put it this way. when someone comes to you, and currently I'm currently working in 4 different cities right now, working in Manila to plan a new. We talk about CBDs. We're planning a new CBD in Manila as we speak right now, and really thinking what the future, how that has to be different than the other 2 that currently exist. And I'm currently working in Jakarta and in Singapore right now, and something in Vietnam. And you think, how do you manage this without letting people know that someone sitting somewhere is actually planning something out here that's going to be in place for the next 100 years to come? How can we give the right to this person to be able to do that? And I think the most important thing that I learned was uh, the humility of these things, about how you connect and work with people and and bring in every other aspects and ideas, including in that conversation. So inclusivity for me became as a default for any kind of practice that I do, any kind of thinking that I do. And again, when I started thinking about inclusivity very deeply in the last 2 years at least, and that's what my TED talk was about sustainability is not enough anymore, was that inclusivity went for me beyond human beings. It meant it became important to then be inclusive to do with nature, be inclusive to do with every other aspect. Because if I can't be inclusive, include nature as one of the stakeholders in my planning of the city, then the city will fall apart as well. So it became a bit more bigger than just inclusivity of different cultures, different people, different characters that live in the city. So it's been a great journey, because that suddenly just opened up the whole other conversation around how do you measure success in terms of that idea of inclusiveness in doing anything as an insertion in a cityscape.
I feel as if you went a step forward in, I mean, as if, like your conceptualization seems as if we must have by now figured out the human inclusiveness, and therefore you're pushing us in ambition forward to kind of think about, okay, now it's the time for also including the nature. And if we do not do that, we are quite arrogant and somewhat undermining ourselves. But then the thing is that by pushing us to that ambition, I think that it's much stronger kind of like view of back on ourselves of what we didn't achieve in terms of inclusion.
Yeah, I think so too. And I'm not taking away the fact that it is important to be talking about inclusivity, especially in this COVID times, because I do think that in almost every city or every part of the world, not just cities, had to grapple with this question of inclusivity and the in communities during that. There were all the extremes of human nature came out in the last, or it has still been coming out in some form or the other in the last 18-19 months across, including in Singapore. So it's been extremely important, and that's where the governments had to play a role of keeping that national identity, or not national identity in a way, keeping a collective, keeping the collective together. And constantly keeping to reiterate that that inclusivity is more important than exclusivity. As soon as you start saying us and them, we would collapse as a society. Because whenever you're in danger, the innate thing about connecting to identity and all of that just got brought up quite a lot. So I think that's also been quite a challenge right now to think about what does that mean for the future of things.
Interesting. Right. This is the moment of kind of a reflection from my side. Yeah, this is kind of I guess that in Singapore, knowing just a little, much less than obviously than you living there about it, it is an interesting, and it's an interesting point that had to be maintained. I think that what I felt on this side of the continents was more I think that the discourses I came across more often were the discourses related to economic inclusion, that we saw that many people who are on low incomes are much more likely to suffer job loss than the one on high incomes, and that dream or myth that everybody's going to be now able to kind of leave the very expensive cities to find affordable living somewhere in the countryside, that was something that was kind of perpetuated as a possibility and collapsed. And when you're talking about the equity that in the new project that you mentioned, how does that, I mean, what was the concept of that? Does it in any way connect to the concept of inclusion? I mean, I think that I would just backtrack here and ask you about, these ideas of equity. Were they also related to this idea that you mentioned before, or this was something completely different? It was from a different perspective.
I think equity has become more important as a topic for me, especially working in this part of the world, where it's known fact for some time now that the post-COVID recovery is very much a K recovery, where the rich are getting richer and poor are getting poorer, and that of course is creating, or started to create even more, the societal imbalance and a bit of a discomfort and an unrest in the community, because you constantly keep hearing about this people flying into space when there are people dying every other day because they didn't get the shots. So it's just that disparity is just quite high, and I see that more so on your face in developing nations. So the only thing I can bring as a city planner, as a designer, is what can I do in a physical sense to create that sense of equity, that there is, we will think about all the aspects of equal access to the basic necessities and needs, of including opportunities, or like work opportunities in your life, and wherever we can, we should be able to do that. And then we work with the policy guys and the economists and etc. when we are planning anything in any of the places that we're working in right now, that is primary as a starting point for anything new that we do, or even any regeneration aspect that we're looking at.
Mm-hmm. So you're talking about that would be affordability, in fact, in a way,
including affordability. Yes.
Yeah.
This is where the affordable housing question comes up. Absolutely. And Singapore has been fantastic, actually. It's on top of the charts again of how it's managed to provide housing to everyone in terms of subsidized housing. And probably it's one of the highest, I believe, if I'm not wrong, ownership levels of housing in terms of age. And that has been absolutely brilliant as a strategy, because that's also, and they also really well have managed the price rise of even private housing. So in a way, the city has kept that very, very well in comparison to other parts of the world, and a lot to learn from a city like Singapore. Of course, it's very difficult to replicate in other parts of the world because it's a city state and the others are not. And so how do you work with that? But there are some interesting learnings that come out of that, for sure.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think that it's a bold move, and I absolutely believe that if you are a newly independent, 68, they got independence, right? A nation, and you have limited space, and you want to excel in economic terms. You don't want, you can't afford your population to be displaced. Where are they going to go? To the sea? And you have to have a mechanism to keep the housing affordable for your people. Because I mean, if Singapore was Paris, I mean, we still don't have the mechanism to, because so many people are interested to buy a property, to have a property in Paris, as a global capital city. I mean, you have that displacement. You can still allow it because you have the rest of the country. You have like the land around it. When you're Singapore, you can't do that. And I think that they made a move in advance of many. I think that this is a future move that people, I mean, will maybe implement somewhere else, just out of necessity. Maybe as a short-term tool, maybe as a medium-term tool. just to calm this increase of pricing down and be able to actually allow their own people to stay, right?
Yeah.
So I thought that that was it was great. I think that would be likely to. I conscious about your own time, and I would just like to move toward the end of this interview. And I thought to ask you, from your personal perspective, what was this year for you? I mean, how do you, so many experiences, so many places you've lived. How did you digest this crisis? How did you? What was it for you? Who did you?
It's amazing. Personally, it's been emotionally, it's been, of course, very stressful, and I'm sure everyone listening would agree with that. I'm sure it's been stressful for everyone in some form or the other. And especially for me, because I'm not being able to meet my parents for the last 2 years, of course, and my dad is 84 turning 85, so every year matters, and I'm not able to meet them, so that's been quite difficult. But in terms of, I would say, the work-wise, it's been one of the most amazingly interesting years in my career till date, I would say. I just mentioned that we were working on the new capital city for Indonesia, but alongside, I'm currently working on youth in city in Singapore. So what does youth mean for the city in Singapore? And then now we are looking at other cities in Southeast Asia of youth and owning the youth city, youth owning the city, because they are probably the biggest population who are very, very vocal about what their future needs to be and what the others are doing to their future in terms of climate emergency, climate call for action, and all of that. And that work I'm doing right now in a COVID and the post-COVID world of how youth are changing the city. I'm working currently with the Singapore government on the food strategy, which is incredible. And this, I started looking at it in 2019, again, pre-pandemic, coincidentally, about future of food. And here we are, pandemic hits, and every other city is thinking about food resilience. So these are some really, really interesting aspects that we just didn't look at it in the same intensity, which is now coming out in this post, or currently I shouldn't say post-pandemic, in the pandemic world, which are shaking or changing the basic premise of the way we have thought about our cities of the future. The future of manufacturing, food, living, working, etc. So that way has been really, really thought-provoking and really interesting of how we look at it.
Yeah, that's quite amazing. I did read a little bit while we were posting and stuff, and I thought always that the only way to beat the crisis, any crisis, is to try to help others. And I think that you were doing that, and I was really amazed by your work. The things that I heard that you were doing, and the things that I could watch, without being able to go to a conference, is that ability that like when we are in crisis, we help others, we push something forward, and I thought that you're really one of the voices that was doing that, that you were kind of injecting these ideas of positivity after, what can happen after. Let's talk about what can happen after for the better. What is it that we can learn, right? And I thought that was really, really inspiring. I would just like to ask you if there was one thing that you would like to share with our audience as a kind of the last message. What would it be?
Oh wow! I should have actually written that somewhere. What that should be.
Don't worry.
I don't know the exact quote, but I read this amazing quote yesterday. I shared it with some of my colleagues about the people who. It's unfortunate that the voices that we hear the most are normally the people who are, and this is not counting what you just told me, but the unfortunate voices that shout the most are normally the people who are dumb and not sure, and the people we don't hear that much are always are the ones who we should be listening to, but they're always in doubt. And that was interesting. And I'm not saying the quote properly, but that was really, really interesting about how the voices that we constantly keep hearing in the last 18 months. And when you read the news, it's just painful because something wrong is happening somewhere. And people who are shouting the most are sounding the most confident about themselves. But that's just noise. And we just need to just dig deeper and think about the people who are not shouting or not speaking. And sometimes it's important to hear that. And I've tried constantly to just keep away from noise and look at what we can do beyond that noise. And I really hope, because in this age of information constantly beeping on our phones every minute, or the news channels that we love watching, there is a lot of noise, and that will just frustrate the hell out of all of us. And we just need to sometimes switch that off and think about what we can do beyond.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think that this is the best note to conclude. It was an absolute pleasure speaking with you, absolute honor. I was really inspired by everything that you said and the things that you've done over the last 18 months. They were my checking point, weekly checking point, through it was, because as you said, it is rare to find people who, keep on the positive and focus on the future and focus beyond. And I think that this is the only way, or literally, to beat the crisis, to know that you helped someone, or you helped cities, or you helped our development beyond the crisis in the future. So I think, thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Anna, for inviting. And as I said, I was looking forward to our chat. So no, it was great. It's a perfect end to, I would say, to my week here in Singapore.
You were listening to the podcast Inclusive Urban Futures with Anna Rosenfeld. Please stay tuned for the next episode.